Chapter 25, Acid-Base Imbalances. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about pH as well as buffers and how the respiratory system and the renal system help to restore our body's pH. And then we'll talk about respiratory and metabolic acidosis and alkalosis. Okay, but that theme will come up. It's all about pH. So what does pH stand for? It stands for power of hydrogen. So we're really looking at our hydrogen ions. Normal values for adult blood pH is between 7.35 and 7.45. And when our blood pH becomes altered, so out of this range, then it can really impair a lot of cellular functions. For example, one thing hydrogen ions do is it blocks sodium channels. So just like how calcium blocks sodium channels, and how when we change calcium levels, we can change excitability of our cells, hydrogen ions do the same thing. So when we have too much hydrogen ions, we'll be blocking too many sodium channels, and our cells essentially get depressed and less likely to fire. Now, where do we get acids from? So we have individual acids from byproducts of energy metabolism. So carbonic acid, lactic acid are some examples. Then we also see hydrochloric acid in terms of our digestive system. And we have an acid known as keto acids. That's essentially food for our brain. So when our blood glucose is low and our brain doesn't have glucose to utilize, then our liver will make ketones. And so our brain can utilize keto acids for energy. And then carbon dioxide. So the more carbon dioxide we bring into the body, it will actually turn into carbonic acid. So that also plays a role. So if blood or other body fluids become either too acidic or too alkalytic, so out of that normal range, then again, dysfunction of cells and even death can occur. So death can occur if pH falls below 6.9 or if pH rises above 7.8. Now, there are three major mechanisms that we have to regulate our pH within the body. And the first are buffers. So buffers are just chemicals that will bind up hydrogen ions so that our pH does not change. The most important buffer in the body is our bicarbonate ion here. Okay, so HCO3 minus, so bicarbonate ion. And the normal ratio of bicarbonate ion to carbonic acid is about 20:1. And any deviation can really alter blood pH. So it really shows you how important buffers are and how important specifically bicarbonate ions are. But anything that really binds up hydrogen ions is considered a buffer because it's buffering changes in pH. So phosphate, hemoglobin can also bind hydrogen ions. So hemoglobin in our blood, red blood cells, are also a buffer. Certain proteins can do that as well. Now, if the buffer system is being used, we have other organ systems that can also help. And the first one is our respiratory system. So the respiratory system is able to change our blood pH by changing CO2. So the more CO2 we have in our body, the more carbonic acid we have in our body. So we will either hyperventilate or hypoventilate to either remove or keep CO2 to change our pH accordingly. So if we were to hyperventilate, that means we're going to move more air, including more air out of our body. So we're going to breathe out more CO2. And so by breathing out more CO2, we'll actually decrease acids in our body. When we hypoventilate, we're going to breathe out less air, so less CO2 gets taken out of our body and more CO2 stays in our blood. And so more CO2 in our blood means more acids in our blood. The other system, organ system, is our renal. So our kidneys can, again, excrete or retain hydrogen ions or bicarbonate ions to buffer our pH or to maintain our body's pH, as well as excreting or retaining metabolic acids. So, our respiratory responses to changes in carbonic and metabolic acids. So what can our respiratory system do? So again, it all goes back to the role of CO2. So CO2 in our body really equates to acids in our body. So when we have high CO2, we have a lot of acids. So our pH will decrease, will become acidic. And so our respiratory system will hyperventilate to try to get rid of that CO2, to get rid of the acid. Conversely, if we have low CO2, we have less hydrogen ions, and so we have an increase in pH. And so we would actually hypoventilate to try to retain the CO2. Now, just because our change in pH is due to something that's metabolic um, as a source as opposed to changes in CO2, it doesn't mean our respiratory system can't still kick in to correct the pH imbalance. So here we saw pH changed because we changed CO2. And so it makes sense our respiratory system will try to restore CO2 back to normal. But over here, these two examples, we're actually seeing changes in pH because of changes in metabolic acids. It doesn't matter. Our respiratory system will still try to help to fix that. So when we have a decrease in pH, when we become too acidic because we're making too many metabolic acids, our respiratory system will still hyperventilate to try to remove CO2 and remove the acids from our body. So it's a compensation. It's not a correction. Okay, and then conversely, if we have an increased pH, because we don't have enough acids, we'll hypoventilate to try to retain the CO2. Now, what about the renal system? Our kidneys will also respond accordingly. So when we have an increase in hydrogen ions, we will try, and a decrease in pH, we'll actually secrete more hydrogen ions, and we'll try to keep the bicarb. Conversely, if we have an increase in pH and as a result a decrease in hydrogen ions, and we'll try to eliminate less hydrogen ions. We want to keep it, and we'll actually get rid of bicarbonate. Okay, so I said over and over again how CO2 in our body is equal to acids in our body. So when we have CO2, it will combine with water, and we really see this happening in our red blood cells, and that will turn into HCO3, which is our carbonic acid, and then that will then become hydrogen ion and bicarbonate ion. So when we have respiratory acidosis, that means our blood pH is too acidic because of a respiratory issue. So we are actually retaining more CO2 in our body. We have high CO2 in our body. And so what that does is it pushes the equation to the right, this way. So in respiratory acidosis, we'll see a lot of CO2, as well as an increase in carbonic acid, hydrogen ions, and bicarb. With respiratory alkalosis, the reason we have alkalosis, a low acid level, is because we have less CO2. And so what we'll see is we'll see low CO2, and everything will be pushed kind of to the left. So everything goes to the left. So that means bicarbonate ion will be low, hydrogen ions will be low, carbonic acid will be low. With metabolic acidosis and alkalosis, the reason you have acidosis and alkalosis is because we have changes in metabolic acids like keto acid production or lactic acid production, and as well as we'll see changes in bicarbonate ion accordingly. So the more metabolic acids we create, we're going to raise our hydrogen ion, the acid level, and lower pH, and our bicarbonate ions will also lower as they try to buffer it. And then conversely, when we have low hydrogen ions, we'll essentially have more bicarbonate because they're really not acting as a buffer at this point. Now, even though the change in pH here happened due to a metabolic issue, we will still try to fix it with the help of our respiratory system. Okay, so our respiratory system, our buffers are very, very important, but in terms of organ system, our respiratory system is the one that really tries to kick in to change pH. So it's really, really important to adjust CO2 levels. So really the respiratory system is more important than the renal system in trying to restore pH. And it's also quicker. We can change our ventilation very quickly. Okay, so we have one worksheet to do that looks at acid-base. So normal pH values, remember, is 7.35 to 7.45, and normal partial pressure of CO2 in the arterial circulation is 40 millimeters of mercury. Now for each, you're going to tell whether the imbalance is respiratory or metabolic in nature, and whether it's acidosis or alkalosis, and then suggest, how this could have occurred. So in client A, pH is 7.1. Okay, so already we know the pH is lower than normal, so we have acidosis. Then we see that the partial pressure of CO2 is actually normal and bicarbonate ion concentration is low. So if we look at CO2 and we see that that's normal, then that tells us the respiratory system is not the issue. So what we know is he must be suffering from metabolic acidosis. So what could be causing the metabolic acidosis? Maybe anaerobic exercise, maybe too many keto acids being produced because he's a diabetic, maybe it's due to renal failure. In client B, his pH is also 7.1, so he's also suffering from acidosis, but his partial pressure of CO2 is 60 millimeters of mercury. So what we see is he has more CO2 than normal. And so all of that CO2, remember, we already know that CO2 in the body is equal to acids in the body. So it makes sense that he probably has respiratory acidosis because his respiratory system is not working like it should. It's retaining more CO2, and that is why he is acidic. So what could cause that? Obstructive respiratory disease like emphysema or bronchitis, where you can't eliminate the exhale and eliminate the CO2 like you normally should. And that's it for this chapter.